Okay, so we're going to continue with these videos. Once again, what these are doing are giving you a general overview of some of our case studies in the imperialism section of this unit. And there is one on South Africa. There's going to be one on North Africa, India, China, and then this is the one on the rest of Africa. What we mean by that is sub-Saharan Africa with the exclusion of South Africa. And once again, with all of these, the historical thinking skill that we are practicing here is the skill of continuity and change over time. Being able to look at an event through various time periods, the beginning, the middle, the end, and kind of understand and outline what some of the changes are, what some of the continuities are, things that are staying the same throughout that time period. In this respect, it would be, of course, the presence of Europeans and the growing dominance of Europeans over those African civilizations, particularly due to industrialization. So once again, we're going to begin with the early contact and then the way Europeans initiate and maintain control, and then finally the responses of the colonized people. So with every single group in Africa, remember, European contact begins along the coast. Why? Because they lack immunity to the diseases of the interior. That will change with the Industrial Revolution. Second, they're there for trade. Why? Because they were blocked out of trade by the Ottoman Empire in 1453, and now they're being forced to explore around Africa. This is why they're there, and this is where they're at. Now, what's the next thing that's going to initiate some change in this part of Africa? It's going to be the Industrial Revolution. Various stages of the Industrial Revolution bring us three really important things. Medicines, in particular quinine, which is going to protect you against malaria. Machine guns, which is going to give them the dominance militarily. And then steamships, which will allow them to penetrate in the interior. Now, with these new things, if all the Europeans went in at the same time, there would be war, there'd be conflict. So we have Otto von Bismarck organizing and leading the Berlin Conference, which is going to also be known as the Scramble for Africa. What this will do is wherever you had colonies on the coast, you now are going to extend those colonies into the interior. So it was a controlled way of mapping out who was going to get what parts of Africa. Remember the images, though, that we looked at in the Nearpod. Who's not going to be present? Any Africans. Is this an example of social Darwinism? Absolutely. This idea that the Europeans are superior, and they were militarily in no other way. And remember, the only reason they were superior militarily was because of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the next thing you want to consider here, we've been talking about just a little bit here, social Darwinism and its impact. Well, you'd need to remember, though, that there were different types of explorers, different types of Europeans going into Africa. You had Livingstone, which was generally, he endeavored to learn the native local languages, he respected the people. And then you have on the flip side of that, Stanley, who was in charge of the Belgian Congo, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Just absolutely an awful individual, exploiting people, using violence. So you have these two sides, kind of the good side, which is this mission to civilize, right? You want to help people. And then you have the bad side, which is just dominate and exploit. So let's look at, and there'll be elements of both Livingstone and Stanley as we go through here, the mission to civilize and exploitation. Let's look at mechanisms of control in the Congo. And remember that reading was Leopold's Ghost. And also among the Igbo people. And that region was represented by the book Things Fall Apart. So let's just outline some of the mechanisms of control that they used in both of those regions. And I think I'm going to show you on the map here where those regions are. Yes, okay, so here's the Congo, just so that you have a geographic location. And then the Igbo people are up in that region that we've been studying quite a bit, where all of our earlier trade empires, Islamic trade empires, were like Songhai, Mali, and Ghana. So the Igbo people are there. So let's start with the Congo. And if we look at mechanisms of control being used in Leopold's Ghost by people like Stanley for the Belgian government, particularly the King Leopold, we're going to see that it was mostly violence. They had slave plantations, which ironically were called like the Free Republic. They were nothing but, they were anything but free. But but they were using labor and slavery as a mechanism control, reinforcing that with violence, and initially getting your in through trickery. And things fall apart. We see a lot less dominance and a lot more hegemony at play. So they're going to use religion first. Remember how they gain control. They build their church in the evil forest. And because they survive, this allows the people to kind of think, oh, well, now their God must have some power. You see your lower level people converting to the religion first. How do they get the upper class people to convert? Well, they link schools with the churches. The way you're going to get the government jobs, the legal jobs, is going to be if you have a European education. So a lot of people are going to convert in order to be able to have access to the schools, which will then get them the jobs in the local government and the courts that the Europeans are setting up. And for a lot of people, particularly people who did not have power traditionally in Africa, they're going to see this as a good thing, as a way to kind of gain power, gain control, whereas previously they had none. So religion, violence, labor, trickery, schools, and then the government and the legal courts. Now, there's one other thing that's kind of going on in this part of Africa, and it's the freed slave states. So Britain is going to establish Sierra Leone, America is going to establish Liberia, and the thing is, after slavery is abolished, the question becomes, well, what do places like Britain and America do with all of their freed slaves? This was a major controversy. When you study U.S. history, you'll see that this is something that's not easily decided. One of the ideas is a Back to Africa program where people who were formerly slaves could go back to Africa. And of course, once again, Americans going to Liberia, capital of which was Monrovia, and then people from Britain going back to Sierra Leone. The problem with this is that often when the people went back, they didn't speak the native languages, they didn't practice the native religions, they weren't really African, they were American, they were British. And herein lies like the roots of many of our problems today as well, right? Now, finally, the responses of the colonized people all throughout this middle section of Africa, you see religion, you see Islam becoming a major rallying point. So most of these people, not most, but many of these people in this part of Africa had converted to Islam during the earlier period that we already studied, right? So Islam is going to be this thing that's going to unify the people against this outside force. And keep in mind, the outside force was also often Christian, right? And we know religion was being used as a mechanism of control. So using their native religion or Islam as a way to unify is going to be a very powerful tool. So we have a few, if you look at the map here, we have a few people that you want to know, like where they were. Uthman Fodio, he's leading, he's a very brilliant military strategist, and so a lot of this is going to be similar to what we saw in South Africa with Shaka and the Zulu people. They're going to organize militarily because they know that violence is being used. This is the way they're going to have to defeat them. And he is very successful for a time, creates the Sokoto Empire. To the north of him, we have Umar, and once again, he's going to organize militarily, but eventually will be defeated by the French. And then Touré in the kind of eastern section. And once again, he's going to be defeated by the French. The thing to know about all of these men, though, is that they're organizing and unifying the people through religion. These are Islamic rebellions. They're trying to go back, right? They're trying to go back and resurrect the superiority of the Islamic state. And they're going to use that as a rallying cry. Okay, so Islam, religion, as a way to fight against the Europeans. Now, in Ethiopia, we see probably the most amazing thing. Ethiopia was just brilliant. Remember, we saw that during the Islamic era, Ethiopia was kind of a stronghold. It held out and remained Christian. And during this period of imperialization, we see that King Menelik II, he's going to copy all the Western technology, more so than anybody else. He's going to bring in those guns, the machine guns in particular, and organize against, in this case, the Italians. And he's actually going to be able to defeat them. So this is a huge, huge win for Ethiopia, and it remains independent for quite some time. Italy, the beginning of World War II, they will try to invade, and they will invade Ethiopia once again. And that's kind of a legacy of this, right? So brilliance on the part of the Ethiopians. And remember, when they're copying, that's very similar to Russia. That's very similar to what we'll see Japan will do. The ones who copy are always the ones who succeed. Now, down here, if you look at the bottom, I'm writing stuff again. So we also see acts of resistance in the Congo. People are fighting back. We see the repercussions of that. They have their hands cut off and things like that. Go ahead and look through those images again. And then with the Igbo people, that's the whole story, right? They fight back as well. Okonkwo is believing, still believing in his native religion, and he's using this as a way to like join the people together and fight back, and he does it through violence. He kills the native people who were working for the government, and he comes in, and they come in and try to stop the meeting, and he just kills them, right? So we see that as well as this act of resistance. So I want you to understand here that people are unifying in so many different ways, and we see it in all of these different regions of Africa, and they're fighting back, right? What's going to make the decision of whether they win or lose? Do they have those machine guns? I mean, I hate to say it, but it really comes down to the machine guns. Up here, right? Up here we have these three things that are coming in from the Industrial Revolution: medicine, quinine for the Europeans, machine guns for the Europeans, that's what gives them dominance, and then steamships, that's what gave them the ability to penetrate into the interior, right? But most importantly, it's the machine guns. That's the last thing that's going to kind of defeat each of these groups. If the other groups don't have that technology because they hadn't industrialized, they're going to lose, right? The only reason King Menelik the second wins is because he adopts that technology and has the income in order to buy that technology too, right? You're not going to see the other groups being able to kind of organize and unify quickly in that type of fashion. And this leads to one of the main things about Africa that's going to be different from China, different from India, is that in Africa it was much more decentralized. We had many more smaller tribal-based societies rather than your huge, large empires. And that's going to prove to be a disadvantage for them during European conquest, because they're not able to mobilize the way Ethiopia will, for example, which did have a large empire. And we're going to see that that's just really becomes a major detriment for them. Okay, finally, cooperation. So far, we've looked at all these ways that people are fighting back. Yeah, but they're also cooperating. Seigneurs, remember, those are the women in North Africa. It's a French term for people who, actually helped the European men by giving them information about the culture and how it worked so that the Europeans could better tear it apart, right? Or translated for them so that they could come up with the treaties to buy the land, or come up with ways of like entering into business and trade with some of the people that were there. So the women, the seigneurs, provide so much information. And remember, this is very much like in the Aztec civilization when Cortez came in, took Melina as his concubine, as his mistress, and then she gave him all of this information on how the Aztec Empire worked, that it was a conglomeration of loose city-states, that the city-states didn't really like the Aztecs and would probably join with them against the Aztecs if they asked. Same type of thing is going to happen in Africa, and particularly through women who are being taken as concubines, taken as mistresses, okay? Now, there's also cooperation among the Igbo people. So things fall apart. That reading shows a lot of the cooperation that was taking place. And I want to just outline that in a little bit more detail here, so that you have those people who are traditionally in African society lower class. Those people are going to be the first to convert and the first to begin to go to the schools that the Europeans have set up. Now, that really doesn't matter too much until you realize that those schools are access points to jobs within the colonial government. If you are an African and colonization has now taken taken place, the way you achieve power in this new structure is to work for the Europeans, whether in government or in the legal courts. You want to get one of those government jobs because that gives you access to a little more power. That gives you access to a little bit more wealth. That keeps you from being punished and tortured and victimized by the Europeans, which was the thing that happened to most of the people, right? So a lot of people, because they want to save themselves, because they want to save their families, right? We'll talk about this again when we get to World War II and the Nazis and why some of the soldiers did what they did. In order to save yourself and your family, wouldn't you do anything to save your family? Even cooperate potentially with the enemy, because you know that your children will at least survive, right? At least they'll survive. So there's a lot of cooperation on the part of the Africans. And the way it happens is through joining these churches, which then leads to access to the schools and gives them access to these jobs. Now, the thing that eventually the people begin to realize is that, of course, and they knew it from the beginning, but still, it's like the lesser of two evils, is that they begin to realize that eventually there's a glass ceiling, right? And what this glass ceiling means is that you can only achieve a certain level within the hierarchy, this new hierarchy that's been established, right? So that your jobs, you might be higher than some other Africans, but you will never be higher than the lowest European, right? So it looks as though you can climb further up that ladder and get better and better jobs. But in fact, there's this glass ceiling that you're going to hit if you're not European, right? If you're African. So that it gives this, and this was a brilliant piece of hegemony on the part of Europeans, it gives this appearance as though you can still have power and still have control, but it's all an illusion, right? Because the Europeans are there for one thing and one thing only, and it's their benefit. Even those that are coming in and talking about this mission to civilize, right? We're going to bring technology. We're going to bring medicine. We're going to bring railroads, stuff like that. What's the industrialization being used for, though? The railroads, it's being used to transport the goods that the Europeans need. Or if there's a revolt, it's being used to move those soldiers to that place of that revolt very quickly so that you can put it down, right? I mean, make no mistake, all the things that the Europeans bring to Africa, it's there for their benefit and their benefit alone. The only thing you could make an argument against that for are some of the cultural things that they do. And we talked about some of these in class. For example, this idea that twins are evil because they are splitting a soul in half and therefore need to be put out and die of exposure. They end things like that. You could make an argument that maybe polygamy was bad. Maybe that's questionable. Polygamy serves a lot of functions within societies that are good functions. So they come in, they end polygamy. They end foot binding in China. I think we can all agree that that's a good thing that they do. They end sati in India, which we'll talk more about later as well. And we can all agree that's a good thing that they do. So there are some elements of positive things they're coming in and doing, but it's more so because they think their way is superior and they think their way is perfect, and therefore they want to change these savages. And less to do with the fact that they want to make those societies in Africa strong, because they don't. They want to make them a little bit more like Europe, but they never want them to be Europeans. And we'll see that later on with the ways that, even in Egypt, we'll talk about Egypt in a little bit, they were fine with helping Egypt until Egypt became competition. Then everything stops. And the same thing is true in this part of Africa. They're fine with helping them become more, quote unquote, civilized, this mission to civilize. But they're only willing to do that insofar as it suits their needs, right? So it's a very complex situation here that we have with the way European colonization was working in this part of Africa. we'll talk a little bit more about this in the other regions we're going to look at. But hopefully this gives you like just a general understanding of how it was working, and we'll clarify some things and add more details in some of the later lectures that I'll do here through the video lectures. Okay, next one's coming up soon.